Hello, I'm Maureen McDowell, the founder and executive director, and this is episode 3 of Typewriter Talk. We use this time to interview local writers and kind of get inside their head about their writing process and also showcase current work that they are working on or books that have just been released, which is the case with you, J.D. Scott, who we have here today.
Yes.
Why don't you tell us about your book of short stories that just came out?
Of course, I have a newly released book of short stories. It's called Moonflower Nightshade, All the Hours of the Day. It's a collection of 10 stories. They span a lot of different types and genres. There's everything from literary fiction to sort of magical realism. There's a couple of stories that lean more like young adult. So I sort of have a variety of genres, and some are a little more experimental, poetic. So it kind of runs the gamut of different types of stories.
Interesting. So what was kind of the inspiration for this book?
Well, I sort of had a time in my life where I was a little bit prolific with writing, and I don't think I really set out to write a short story collection, but it was a point where I had amassed about 30 or 40 stories, and I started to edit them down. And I think maybe because before I started sort of playing around with fiction and stories, I was a poet first. And I think the way when you're a poet, right, as I'm sure you know, is when you order a manuscript, right, there's certain things you do with this entire process because you have so many poems and you're sort of trying to connect the dots. And so that felt like an easy transition for me, sort of what you do with a poetry manuscript, sort of with the stories. And it was trying to edit down, find themes, find connections, whether it's like a love story or a breakup story, or even some sort of thematics, stories of loss or transformation. So I was kind of looking at these patterns and trying to look at these and find these echoes. And I think that's how the manuscript started to come together.
So you mentioned some major themes. What are your major themes through your work? Or do you have some? Because some writers kind of revisit the same questions, quandaries, or, that they're trying to work out or see it from a different angle. What are some of your major themes?
That's a really good question. And in this book, I mean, there are definitely themes of sort of loss, but in a way, it's a lot about change and movement. And as I said before, sort of transformation, sort of willing to be transformed and becoming someone else. I think there's also a lot of emotional stakes with the characters in these stories. Some of them are sort of quite emotionally charged in a way. And that's something I'm really interested to. I mean, whether it's thematic or whether it's sort of just more plot devices, is kind of having these psychologically or emotionally charged characters.
Well, I think anyone who's going through, as you said, a transformation or a change or loss is going to have that intense feeling of leaving behind the past and becoming something totally new, which is why a lot of people stay stuck in situations, because they don't want to go through all that, hero's journey, turmoil, whatever journey, and so I think that's interesting that you like being at that edge.
I do, yeah.
Where, there's that death and rebirth and transformation, and writing about that, because a lot of people are scared to death to even go there. So, and that's where you're like, I want to play in this area.
Yeah, and I think that's what excites me is sort of getting inside these different characters' heads and sort of figuring out what are the stakes of their lives, and also wanting to be somewhere very different at the end of each story than where we are at the beginning.
Oh, cool. Interesting. Because I had another writer that I interviewed, and he mentioned that someone told him that you would find in the beginning of the story the ending, so that it's kind of like this full circle. And that's why I think these interviews are so interesting, because everybody has a different process and like a different way they come about stuff. And
I think there's always like a reverberation of the opening and the ending on some capacity. I think some, more more obvious than others. And I definitely have some of those stories too. I mean, I definitely have a story where a character kind of refuses to change and there's an echo of the beginning at the end.
You use the word echo twice. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is your writing process? Do the characters talk to you and you chase them down, or do you plot out an outline, or and what? Another writer said that she was drawn by the setting. That really informs her writing. What is your writing process?
Setting is really important, I think, to some degree, but I'm certainly not a planner with short fiction for the most part. I think the way I always sort of describe it is there's these layers where there might be something that I'm interested in, whether it's a character's voice. Maybe I do have a little bit of the voice in my head for the character, or I have this setting, or there's something I'm playing with, whether it's like a retelling of a fairy tale or a myth. But sometimes it feels like I'll have, like 3/4 of the components for the recipe, and I know there's some sort of layer missing, so I don't necessarily begin the work yet. And sometimes I'm like, oh, okay, that's the last thing I need. And I think that's what interests me about fiction, or this complexity of there's more space to layer up all these different components and try to make them work at the same time, whether it's like an image that's being repeated or something else while all this other stuff is happening.
Yeah, that sounds very poetic.
Yeah, and I think I do have a poet's approach to fiction. I mean, in terms of plotting, it's usually the opposite, where I sort of let the language carry me forward. So it's sort of one sentence at a time, sort of moving toward the end. And maybe I have a vague idea of the end, but I sort of figure out the journey while I'm in the process of writing. I don't really outline that much.
So how long have you been writing?
For a very, very long time. In terms of fiction, really only seriously about 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
I did have a couple of stories. Two of the stories in the book are older than that, from about 2010 or 2011. And before that, I mean, I was doing poetry since like 2000. So, I mean, 20 years worth of poems and stories, and it's finally kind of coming together.
Yeah, it takes a while sometimes. Not for everybody, but there are those of us that are late bloomers. And
yeah, and I definitely feel like, I mean, I've been writing a long time, but I think it took me a very long time to sort of figure out my voice, or figure out what I'm interested in. And I think at some point, I don't know if you've had this experience, but I feel like I was trying to like push back against my natural urges, or trying to be other writers, or, trying on other people's voices. And it's sort of, my voice was always there in the background all along. And I just had to become confident and become acquainted with my own interests and passions and obsessions, and kind of figure out how to voice that.
yeah, I think I was pretty fortunate to kind of discover my voice early on. I still know I haven't gone as dark as I think
Yeah. Yeah.
is there. There's a part of me that um,
You resist the shadows.
yeah, but it's interesting because I always try to kind of, one of my themes is light and transformation, but it's always about going through the transformation. But sometimes like there's just not anything that you can fix, and you kind of have to be there. But I was fortunate. Well, I don't know if it's fortunate, but the types of writing I wasn't drawn to. I didn't study writers to be a writer. I just wanted to write. So I have another friend that he studied all the greats, and when he started writing, he was writing like the greats, and it took him longer to find his voice because he had so much influence in him. But honestly, like when I was really, really into reading when I was younger, it was metaphysical books, because I was trying to heal a lot of deep childhood wounds and I wanted to feel better. So, but that kind of informs my poetry.
Yeah, I mean, those things you sort of spend time with, it gives you a different sort of lexicon, whether, the metaphysical books is sort of different sort of verbiage or terminology to access, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't do it different. So
Mhm.
So you teach, and so what is a typical day for you as a writer?
That's a really good question. I don't necessarily write on a schedule. I don't know if that's more of a poet thing or
Everybody's
not. If
different.
it's,
Everybody's different.
uh, that's something I really had to learn. I mean, I had a mentor a while ago, and I once said to her, I was like, I know I should be writing every day. And she was like, why do you have to be writing every day? And I was like, because everyone says write every day. And she was like, well, if that's not your process,
Mhm.
why would you write every day? And I was like, oh, wow. And it was the first time anyone had ever really challenged one of those things you hear all the time, whether it's, show, don't tell, write every day,
Yeah,
these sort of writer adages you hear all the time. And some of them do go relatively unchallenged. And that's one
yeah.
that really opened up a lot for me because, sometimes I won't write for a week or weeks, and then I'll sit down and pour out sort of my thoughts. So it's a little, it definitely, because I mean, I do teach long hours too.
Yeah.
So it does feel like I'm sort of writing in these little moments, sort of
Mhm.
in betweens.
And it's important, I think, as a teacher to express that to students. Like some people like to write in the morning, some people want to write at night, some people want to write in quiet, some people prefer cafes, some people need long stretches of time, some people just need snippets. Like that's the thing, you try on all these different hats and kind of see what fits you. And
Right.
and I think that that is one of the challenges of being a new writer is you don't necessarily trust yourself yet. You
That's so
you
true.
don't know the process, um, which can be really, really exciting, like a first date, but when you're
Right. I
20
mean, I think
years
there's
in,
it's kind of nice when you don't necessarily have memorized these patterns of other people's processes yet, because you're just sort of living in the moment. I mean, there's kind of a lot of wonderful things about sort of being new to the writing process and sort of figuring out yourself. And my process has always changed, as I sort of playing around with a novel, like I had to be a little more of a planner or a little more carving out time to work on that, because otherwise it was never going to get done. Versus stories and poems, I can work as the ideas sort of come, and that's always sort of, that process is always sort of changing, but it definitely depends on my sort of schedule, what's going through my head, what's in my life.
yeah. So what advice would you give your early writing self?
Hmm. I think one is trust your voice, trust your interests, and trust your obsessions, even if other people don't necessarily get them, or don't feel as passionate. Um, and one thing I do think I did when I was sort of younger and starting out is I didn't necessarily have an idea about like taste with reading. I just read everything, whether it's a classic or a graphic novel or poetry or an art book, or a novel or short stories, like nonfiction, self-help books. I kind of read a little bit of everything. And I think that really informed a lot of my processes and sort of the way I write. And I think that's really healthy, to read outside of the genre you
Yeah.
write in. And I mean, especially with fiction writers, I mean, I wish more fiction writers read poetry, because I think when fiction writers read poetry, it really helps them grasp language on the sentence level.
Yeah. Yeah. And also how to say so much in such a little space.
Yes.
Like that's such a, I mean, like a sentence can just stop you dead. One sentence.
Right.
Like I remember reading this book. I won't say which one, but it was the big young adult novel. And I came across it and I'm like, all right, like I have to figure out why this is the biggest young adult novel ever. And the whole book, it was pretty good. I mean, it was a pretty good story, but there was one line in the book. And I said, okay, this is why I read this whole book. Cause I was going like, I mean, this is okay. Like, but he had this one line in it. And I just go, okay, I feel nurtured and satisfied. And I'm
Mm.
glad I went on this whatever 5-hour journey with you.
Yeah, I love that,
Time.
that one sentence could make it worth it.
Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. So, what are you reading right now? Who are some of your favorite authors? It's kind of a two-part question, or maybe you're reading your favorite authors,
I
right?
just finished a graphic novel called Hot Comb by Ebony Flowers. And I think it was on Drawn and Quarterly. And it's sort of these different tales of African American women sort of growing up, sort of centered around hair, the politics of Black hair.
Mhm.
But I think she kind of mixes memoir, like graphic memoir, with sort of short stories. So there are all these short tales, but it's really wonderful. And I always forget how much I really love sort of slice of life stuff, and
Yeah.
especially like slice of life comics.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
So
I think I, we can get kind of lofty and want to have, at least me, like big ideals and big thoughts, but some,
right,
some of the best writing just like, it just grounds you, and it kind of, it centers you in the human experience. And it sometimes as simple as like what it's like to do the dishes,
right, and I mean that sort of every day, and also seeing someone's life and childhood and growing up experiences that are completely different from your own,
Yeah.
right? That's how we sort of learn and
Yeah.
expand our worldviews. And sometimes, I mean, I think with other lofty ideas, I mean, I sort of like things sometimes that are a little more fantastical or magical realist or sort
Me
of
too. Yeah.
experimental. And those things can be big ideas and sort of work with the image or the metaphor to impart wisdom. But sometimes it's nice just to have this sort of very literal sort of moment of everyday life. The mundane can be really powerful.
Yeah, because life's both. I mean, it really is both of those things. I mean, we're kind of in that right now.
Right, right. I
I
mean, yeah.
mean, we're all indoors right now because there's a deadly virus outside. Like if
Right.
you,
I mean, this unprecedented moment is both very pedestrian, staying inside, but also, I mean, right. I mean, there is sort of a magic in science, right? I mean, like a pandemic sort of having everyone at home at the same time on a global scale at a way that I've never seen in my lifetime. I mean, there is something sort of magical about that, or sort of magical
yeah,
thinking.
yeah, and pretty much consistently, like people's dreams are so vivid, and I did a post on Facebook of like, is anyone else experiencing like serious deja vu, like on the regular? And
Right.
everyone's like, yes, oh my gosh. And it's like I've imagined this scenario somehow, maybe in my worst case scenario, like if there
Mm.
was a pandemic and how would you survive and what would but it's like, I can't even get over the deja vus. Like, it's weird. So there's definitely like something
Right.
fantastical going on right
I
now.
mean, it's sort of it's like the tropes of like zombie fiction without the zombies, sort of the pandemic and all these things, the spreading of the virus. It does feel like overly familiar in a kind of
Yeah.
strange
But
way.
our obsession with the Waking Dead and
Right.
zombies and what is it, Zombies and Prejudice or whatever, the
Oh yeah,
zombie.
the Pride and Prejudice. What it
Yeah.
is, zombies. That Pride and Prejudice and zombies. That's funny.
Yeah. So, who are your favorite authors?
That's a really good question. I mean, there's a lot of,
Poets or authors, I should say both. Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
Either or.
I think with fiction writers that I'm sort of maybe more into at the moment, I like Kelly Link,
Mhm.
Helen Oyeyami, Manuel Gonzalez. I'm like actually looking at my bookcase over there off frame, thinking about who I've been reading lately. I just started Brian Washington's short story collection, Lot. So yeah, there's a lot. I mean, I love Angela Carter too.
That's what's so cool about reading. Like you're stuck inside, but like I'm
Right.
listening to you read off this list of authors, and I'm like, he's traveling all over into all these wonderful experiences. Like
Right.
it's
Yeah, and I've been also I'm teaching American literature right now, so I've been spending a lot of time with the Norton
the
anthology. Like,
Norton. Yes, I'm an English major, and oh God, they're so heavy. The Norton.
yeah, but it's been fun. I mean, there's stories and writers, where it's always refreshing to revisit, like Zora Neale Hurston, one of our Florida's own, the short story Sweat is a good one. And so these sort of moments through teaching, I'm like, oh yeah, I get to revisit the past and all these writers who we're probably familiar with, but don't necessarily spend time every day, because I feel like there's something about, chasing the new releases, the new
Oh
books.
yeah, that chasing the new releases, that's funny. There's so many. You can't
I
keep
know,
up.
and it's one of those things, sometimes I feel like you just have to resist the urge to, I feel like there's, especially sort of if you're friends with other writers or readers, there's this pressure to be caught up and on the same page. I think it's fine just to push back and disconnect and read whatever you're interested in.
It's very intuitive for me, like what to read. Like there'll be something about the cover or the description that and I'll get, like, it's almost like the same feeling I get a poem. It's like, you have to read that book right now. Like, and that's what really draws me to, I mean, I try to stay current because of Keep St. Pete Lit, but it's really, it's an intuitive process. And I think when you pick books intuitively that way, they naturally are going to give you something that you need in that moment.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Whether it's through the blurbs or the description, right? I think we sort of, I think there is something that almost feels like a sixth sense when you're sort of gravitating toward things that sound like they might speak to you.
So when you get blocked, what gets you unblocked? What inspires you? What gets the juices flowing or whatever?
Definitely reading. I mean, that's something, and it's not always like a 1-to-1 ratio. Sometimes I'll read a poem and it'll make me think of something completely different, but it's sort of, or maybe it's a word or a term or something, or just the syntax of something will ignite something in my own brain. And definitely reading is huge. And I always wish I was reading a little bit more. And I don't know if I necessarily feel like I experience writer's block in that sense, because I think sometimes I just have to remind myself to be patient, where it's, maybe it's not the time for this thing. I mean, like, as I sort of talked about with different layers, and like, maybe there's just a piece of this missing, and maybe I should just set it aside for now, and trying not to be necessarily frustrated with that. Or sometimes where you'll write something, a new short story, and I'm like, oh wow, I'm still like, I'm still messing around with some themes that are in my book, and it almost feels like, I published a short story collection, and you want it to be self-contained, but you're still maybe obsessing over certain things, and it's like, sometimes I feel like I'm ready to move on and do something new, or I want to move on, but there's still things I'm obsessed with, and I can't stop myself from being obsessed with or working through. And I do think I do have a fear where it's like, oh no, what if this is like a one-trick thing I do forever? But it's just, it's that transformation again, right? Not just in your writing, but wanting that transformation for yourself as a writer as well.
Yeah, well, there's so many ways you can take transformation. Like, like there's so many, and we all go through it in multiple ways. Like I keep coming back to the hero's journey, but we have that personally, we have it professionally, we have it if we have children, we're all having one right now. And right. I think, and I love what you said about how you might not necessarily have all the information yet to write something, because you might not have lived it or read it, or experienced it. And I think that comes with, I guess it's age, or also just the longevity of being a writer, to know to be patient. Like, I'm sure a lot of writers right now are like, I have to respond to this pandemic we're in, especially as a poet. And I did get inspired today thinking about, I read a New York Times article about the essential workers who have to ride buses, and then the bus driver. And I thought about, and how the bus drivers are not included with the people in the hospitals as the saviors in this, but they're putting their lives in danger every day to get people to work.
Right.
I just started thinking, like, from a place of privilege, how do I respond? Because I am in a place of privilege,
Mhm.
but I don't have to ride the bus every day. I don't, how do I respond to that? And so that's the thought that's scurrying around, but it hasn't, there's not, the line hasn't showed up or whatever, but it's something about the
Right.
driver. It's something about the bus driver. So,
And I
um,
think those ideas stick with us. And I think those sort of emotional truths or sort of the realism of that is always uh, sort of churning through our minds. And yeah, I mean, I mean, I don't know how I'm sort of going to,
yeah,
process this moment. I tend to process things after the fact, although it's kind of funny is uh, like a few months before this began, I was sort of doing my take on like my own version of a sort of zombie story. And so with a pandemic, um,
yeah.
and now I'm like, I don't even know how to touch that. So that's been set aside.
Chelsea Catherine, I interviewed her for episode 1. She is, the book she's working on right now is about, she kept having night terrors about an empty downtown St. Pete
Mm,
last summer. And I was like, whoa. And I'm like, are you setting that work aside? Because it's almost like, redundant now. And she goes, no, I know I need to write whatever the story is. And she's still in it. And I love that, because
um,
she goes, my life's not really that different, because I would go to work and then be home, and I'm solitary a lot. And so I just thought, but it comes back to trusting yourself,
um,
as a writer, and trusting the process. So, what are you working on right now?
That's a really good question. I mean, I'm working on a lot of short things. I'm kind of playing around with a YA novel. I don't want to say too much because then it almost
No.
seems like I'm holding myself. But I'm a little short fiction. I did finish a draft of an adult novel, um, but there's a lot. It's very complicated and complex and long, and it's going to take a lot of work to get it to a second draft. So I've kind of opened that and cracked at that a little bit, but I mean I worked on it for like 2.5 years, so it's kind of mostly in a drawer right now because I want to do some short work again. So
Yeah.
definitely trying to perhaps finish a YA manuscript because that's certainly a less word count and just a couple of short stories too. But I'm not really, I like what you said about trusting the process, and I'm not necessarily trying to force any of them out. So I definitely feel like my writing has slowed down a lot, but I know I'll get there, in a bit. I mean, the other thing too, which I feel like a lot of people don't necessarily talk about, but for me, sort of trying to see a finished book manuscript into the world took a lot of my similar creative energy and
Yeah.
emotional
Oh yeah.
energy.
Oh yeah.
So I feel like a lot of the leftover energy I had, when I'm not working or teaching or whatever, went into trying to see this book into the world.
You gave
So
birth.
right. I mean,
That's
yeah. I mean, it does
amazing
really feel like
process.
it does feel like your sort of baby in a way is sort of
Yeah.
being seen, and so I think I'm still kind of in the middle of that. I think it's going to take a little bit before I really let go, and because at a certain point you're like, okay, it's in the world. What's going to happen is what's going to happen. It's going to find its own journey, its own readers. But before that, I mean, I certainly felt like I had to do as much as I could to try to help it, hold its hand to walk it into the world.
Is your publisher helping with publicity, or is that kind of all on your shoulders?
A little bit, but most of it's on my shoulders. I
Yeah.
mean, luckily they did open up some financial budget, but I mean, I'm fortunate that my book did come out of a prize. So it's published through a prize, but it's kind of this small imprint, and mine's the only book coming out through the university imprint. So it's mainly just kind of a couple of professors who at this point, and none of them are publicity
Mhm.
experts, so I've really had to rely on myself to do all that sort of publicity, which was, I mean, it was fascinating because I sort of had to teach myself to do all that.
Yeah, it's kind of I mean, unless you're like one of the blockbusters, it's the model now. Like,
Right.
You know, you really have to be your own champion in a lot of ways. And I know somebody whose book just came out, and she was supposed to have like a whirlwind book tour because her first book was really successful, and then, you know, a pandemic hit. So she
Right.
did her book launch on Facebook and Instagram Live in her living room, you know, and it's just, I'm really curious to see how this new model that we're in, because we, you know, might be in this for a while,
Right.
how we do things differently creatively. Like even this, the Typewriter Talks, this came about because, you know, we have this extra time.
Right.
And I've always wanted to do this, but I was so busy with meetings and being out and talking to donors for Keep St. Pete Lit. And now I have like this space, and I'm so excited about getting into the brains of writers and
Right.
also
I mean,
for our
thank you for
students.
this. I mean, it's the transformation again, right? We've all sort of had to transform,
Yeah.
and I've really felt an immense sense of gratitude because I was sort of planning some events. I was sort of planning to go on tour this summer, but you know, I sort of pulled out of AWP, the writing
Yeah.
conference that was happening in San Antonio, and that was sort of the cusp of all of this sort of beginning. And you know, there was an online virtual AWP book fair. You know, people were like, "Hey, who was supposed to have a book come out? Who's had events canceled?" You know, and I feel like a lot of people have really stepped up to help other writers who were debuting and
Yeah.
doing things. So I feel like I've had a lot of help from friends and strangers, and gotten a little bit of attention in ways that I might not have if business was being carried
Yeah.
on as usual.
Yeah. Exactly. I'm curious to see the innovation that comes out of this. Like John Kransky, is that how you say his name, from The Office? He has this show called or Some Good News, and he just threw a prom dance last night or a couple days ago, and had all these famous like musicians come in and play the prom dance for all these seniors that couldn't have their. And I just thought that's so innovative and fantastic, and we would not have had that kind of experience, you know, because it wouldn't have occurred to him to in his living room deal with, you know, Billie Eilish and Chance the Rapper coming in on Skype or whatever.
Right. I mean, I
Dude,
think it's been interesting technology experiments. I mean, I know there's been a lot of the sort of reading series and virtual reading series and things like this, you know, these as different talks and interviews. And I think that's kind of wonderful.
yeah. So what would be like your the last question is, what would be like your one-liner advice for writers?
One liner advice. Ooh, that's a lofty, you're
It
putting
doesn't have
some
to be one
pressure.
line, but you know what I mean. Brevity. What would be like your knockout punch kind of?
I think really that the truth behind writing is it's more endurance than anything. You know, I've been writing a very long time. You know, I did writing at a magnet high school. I did writing as a minor and undergrad. You know, I went and got my MFA, and you kind of look who's still writing, and it's sort of less and less. So it's not necessarily about being the best or being the most talented or being the most well connected, but it's really about just sort of staying true to yourself and sticking with the writing and enduring no matter what. Is, you know, you have to sort of have that passion and that love for writing and just keep going no matter what.
Yeah, I love that. Endurance. I like
Yeah.
the one word.
It's one of those things that we don't, I feel like everyone always talks about networking and talent and all these
Yeah.
other things, but really, I mean, endurance is so much of it, to sort of just to keep at it.
It's more the tortoise than the hare.
It is more tortoise than
Yeah, you know, and creating something sustainable and over a long period, not just a sprint. You know, it's the long distance run, which in our very disposable culture, it's not. You know, it's an investment. You're investing in a relationship with your art, because I think if you do write, it's because you have no option. Like you have to.
right.
There's nothing in.
Right. I once, when I was quite younger, I talked to the writer Laurie Siegel, and I remember she said, you know, it's like brushing your teeth or something. It's like these things you do every day. It's like you have to do it as part of your day. I mean, maybe brushing teeth is optional, but you know, like breathing, you know, or something else. You know, it's like involuntary.
Yeah. 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 Like you'll cease to exist almost.
Right. Right.
So why don't you read an excerpt from your book of short stories?
Sure. So I'll read a little bit. I'll just read the opening of this short story where parallel lines come to touch. It is sort of a Florida story. It's set on an island. It's about this young girl, young, she's 18, 19, woman named Riley, and her brother sort of returns from the dead. It's her twin brother who just passed. Um, I don't need to really say much more about it, but it was originally published in Cicada, which was the YA magazine from Cricket Media, and Cricket's like a highlights magazine. It's one of those sort of, but
Forever.
unfortunately, I was in the final issue. They closed Cicada down, but so it was kind of, I sort of imagined as a kind of like a young adult sort of story. So I'll just read the opening, where parallel lines come to touch. After the funeral, my brother came back. It was that same night, nearly dawn, and I was alone. I had told Mom and Dad, I'm okay, before turning in for the night, although no one had asked. It wasn't long before I left my bed to sleep in my dead brother's, which is probably not what someone does when they're okay. I pushed my thoughts somewhere on brother, buried my face in my nightshirt so I'd stop smelling the grease of his hair in the pillow. I wasn't sure what I had wanted. I thought about making sea grape jelly, or else driving an hour north to the old theater, the one where the R came before the E. They made Italian sodas there. There was a silent film they showed with a real living organ player. It was a nostalgia, but whose? We had to go inland to Berry River, travel to drier places where the coffin wouldn't be soaked into salt mud, although most of the earth here was wet, no matter how deep you dug. The funeral home was next to an apothecary where he used to take me in his pickup truck to buy bath bombs. The apothecary was someone else's nostalgia too, like when my mother talked about soda counters at pharmacies in the 50s. I loved soaking in baths, so River took me there at least twice a month. But I don't think I ever noticed the funeral home itself before I had to go inside it. I thought River must have walked all the way back that night. I was mostly asleep, but I heard him unbuckle his belt, drop his pants on the floor with a clink. I wanted to look, to see his body, make sure it was his, but the ceremony was closed coffin for a reason. I was in the corner, facing away, almost trying to lose myself in the space between the bed and the wall, because what kind of brother comes back?
Oh my God, I have goosebumps. I'm so in it. I love that with the theater, with the R, with the E instead of just a little, and when you talk about an apothecary, I can't even say it. I've never been able to say it.
Apothecary, yeah.
I'm thinking of all these like witchy tinctures and then like you're like bath balls. And I love
and
here's my brain because I went like really deep, but you're like, no, gosh. And I love like, growing up here, like I know what you're talking about with like the water you have to go inland. My grandparents like are from St. Pete Beach, but you bury people in inland. Yeah.
Right.
Like silent.
Yeah, it's sort of loose. I mean, we used to go to Anna Maria Island every summer when I was a child, and it's sort of loosely based on Anna Maria Island. And there's sort of, as the story goes on, there's red tide is in the background. And actually, I mean, it's based on red tide from my childhood that I remember.
Oh, yeah.
like going to the beach off season too. So it was even creepier going off season to the beach when it was cold and seeing like octopuses on the shore, and sort of it just sort of being upset by this strangeness. And I think that's kind of talking about sort of the magic in the everyday and these
Mm-hmm.
disruptions. And that sort of came into the story as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was my ding. I haven't figured out how to turn my I got rid of the app for if somebody texts me, but it dings at the right moment. That's
I
the
was like, is it the timer up? The
no,
hourglass?
that's how I'm gonna. Well, yes, but that's how I'm gonna say. I can't figure it out. This new technological thing. I can't. I'm sorry. This is not a perfect video.
I think it's been perfect for me. I mean,
Oh, well, yes. Thank you so much, JD.
thank you
And
so much, Maureen, for having me. I mean, this is
yeah,
such a wonderful idea, and I mean, of everything you do with St. Pete Lit is wonderful. But it's great that you're still, making space for writers and trying to elevate their voices, even with sort of a global pandemic outside our doors.
well, yeah. And I'm gonna, as soon as I'm done here, I'm ordering your book, and we'll have a link um, uh, with your bio about how
I know Tombolo Books has copies, and they're doing. I think Alsace is
envelope.
doing
Yeah.
deliveries on the bicycle or
I'm,
something. So
well, I know, like it's all
there are local deliveries if you're in St. Pete.
yeah, innovative ways to keep moving forward. I think it's wonderful. So thank you so much.
Thank
And this
you,
is
thank
so
you.
inspiring. I love like your perspective and how much you share through your writing and your personhood, but also as a teacher. And I appreciate your time.
Well, I appreciate yours too. Thank you so much for
Thank
having me.
you. Thank you. All right.